everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the session. As you can see, I am not Rosalind. My name is Michelle Biss, and I work with the National Right to Housing Network, and I have the total pleasure of moderating the discussion here with Scott and Linda. I see that there are some excellent questions coming in through the chat, so why don't I start with one early one voiced by Rosalind, which is whether your work is strictly in Alberta, and commenting on the fact that the lack of data pertaining to migration of individuals is really a challenge when they know that so many people are moving from rural to urban areas. So if you wanted to comment on whether you're focused mostly in Alberta and what you do in terms of addressing that migration issue in your data.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So no, we aren't just focused on Alberta. We actually recently rebranded a year and a half ago. Just because we found ourselves doing work outside of Alberta, and we're currently working in British Columbia, Northwest Territories, and Ontario. And the migration question is one that is on everyone's minds. It's very difficult to answer. What we do, it's similar to the point in time count, where you need some identifying information in order to sort of keep track of where people are moving to. Instead of a by name list, we use a unique identifier, just because, in a small town, identifying information can sometimes be a lot. So it's a unique identifier that takes some initials and aspects of the person's birth date. We scramble them all together, and then that creates sort of a private reference point for them. In some of the follow-up projects that we've done in communities, we've been able to use those unique identifiers to see if people have left the community, moved to another community, and that sort of thing. So that's where we're at with that, and we'd love to do more follow-up projects with groups to be able to see those trends a little bit clearer.
Very interesting. Next question, maybe I'll bring up here for either Linda or Scott. Robin voiced, is it captured in the survey questions whether individuals are identifying as 2S LGBTQ+, or non-binary, and if that has impacted their housing stability or their access to services?
So the first answer is yes. The survey follows the guidelines and definitions set out by Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, very similar to what is found in the point in time count with regards to gender identity and sexual orientation. Unfortunately, the number of respondents that we saw that had identified as such were not large enough to really see any trends or to see if they were unable to seek services. And what we do sometimes in the reports is if it's a very small community, we'll actually have to do a little bit of consulting and put our heads together whether or not we would want to fuzz or suppress that data, as often Stats Canada does, just because in a small community, we wouldn't want to be identifying that. But we haven't seen anything as of yet that data would imply that they wouldn't be able to access these services.
Very, very interesting stuff. I have another question here from Jerry, and that's about the definition of stable housing, and a comment that the federal definition of stable is very different than how most folks might define the word. I know in my world, we often use adequacy, and I'm curious, Linda, Scott, do you have any thoughts you'd like to voice on that?
I have lots of thoughts. We don't have enough time today to go over definitions. It isn't, unfortunately, it's a good discussion, and I'm glad that we're having it because on the one hand, those with good intentions, we want definitions that are universal, so all of our ducks in a row, we can make good comparisons across the country and across regional groups. But I think what we're seeing very common, and what we're seeing working closely with groups, is some of those definitions fall a little bit short. A good learning experience for myself was when we're doing work up north, particularly. Some of the definitions that are found in current versions of the survey and the National Point in Time Count survey as well, don't adequately capture, I guess, the traditional way of life. So, if we were to ask someone where they've been living, they might be living off the land. And so, like, by this definition, they're living rough 6 months of the year during the summer, and then they'll return to their community in the winter. And they're not really sure where they fit, because that's not really adequately described. Like, they don't consider themselves to be unstable at all. So that's definitely something I think a lot about, and balancing whether or not it's good to have a strict definition that works for the government versus something that is tailored to the community itself.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more of what Scott had commented on, of course, something like overcrowding isn't in the definition. It's not considered to be at risk of homelessness. And we really find that with our Indigenous communities, that the overcrowding is more than a risk of unsafe environment. And also, it doesn't necessarily take into consideration what it looks like in some communities where there's no running water, there's no clean water, there's sewage backup, and people are living in those conditions. And the language often doesn't identify that. We would identify it, and as frontline service providers would identify that. So there is that disconnect, and there does need to be ongoing conversations about how we can have to flesh it out a bit, because that consistency is important also, but consistency needs to be balanced with what is actually really happening for people in the communities, especially in the northern communities and in Indigenous communities.
Yeah, and also another additional answer to that is we'll work with communities quite often if they engage us to write the reports, or if they're putting theirs together and they just need a phone call to see what they should do. We don't just present the data in terms of like what we know to be homelessness, because at the end of the day, the point of collecting this information is to help clients and help vulnerable people. So if we need to expand in the report on like what we're actually talking about, and we're not just talking about COH's definition of homelessness, we're talking about maybe core housing need according to CMHC, or other needs in the community too. So it's kind of a very much a balancing act.
Well, I think very much on that point, Michelle voiced a question in the Q&A that relates very much, which is how the survey reaches individuals experiencing hidden homelessness that don't access services, and how do you account for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The whole purpose of delivering the surveys this way is to be able to reach as many participants as possible. Sometimes it really depends on the community is the answer. So if there's a smaller rural community, but they are maybe a regional hub for services, they have in Alberta FCSS or other government service deliveries, they have lots of people commuting in to receive healthcare and that sort of thing. That would be a perfect I guess by the book project for delivering an estimation. However, in more rural and remote communities, a good example is actually Conklin, Alberta, which is you would not consider it remote because it's just off the highway to Fort McMurray, but in terms of services, there are zero. And so in that case, what we did is we did a customized approach. So we said, okay, service agency delivery isn't going to work. So instead, let's look at reaching people door to door, asking individuals directly if there's anyone that you feel should be completing the survey. And really that project in itself was, again, less about absolutely unsheltered individuals and more about the state of the housing in the community too. So it does vary, and we recognize that, and so that's why we'll often have to take a customized approach.
And just to add a little bit with the customized approach, in addition to what Scott said, we are currently working with a couple of communities to customize it into the more rural and remote. And so being able to go out into the, not into like a village, but people that are living out in the country and off the land, and working with the service providers to customize an approach to go have the conversation with the folks that are living like that, to be able to obtain the information so they can be more supportive in providing the services for those people.
Very, very interesting. I have another question here from Rosalind, who I think is a very big fan of your presentation and is wondering whether your team would be open to doing some different types of collaboration and capacity building, potentially to the Ontario Reaching Home Regional Advisory Board. And just pointing out that some of the capacity building that's needed within the sector to assisting rural and remote communities in, all throughout the country. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on capacity building, what your next steps are in terms of your work and where you see that going.
So RDN is the community entity for Reaching Home for rural and remote and Indigenous communities in Alberta. And so in response to this, yes, we would be very interested in continuing the conversation and seeing what that looks like. And we totally agree the capacity and the balancing of what is happening with the Reaching Home programs, I think would really benefit for groups that are community entities to get together across the country and have conversations. I know Sydney, who is the manager of the Reaching Home, is in the chat and has answered a couple of questions. And so I know what Sydney is doing is taking down your information, and we will reach out either through the conference or the next day to follow up with you. So thank you very much.
Well, we have 5 more minutes left, which means I get to ask a question. So a rather big one, so please forgive me. I'm really wondering, based on the research and your findings, what's the biggest systemic barrier that perpetuates rural and remote homelessness that you're finding within your survey? What's something that really needs to change, and one of the big barriers to being able to make change with the survey results?
That's a really good one. Who wants to go first, Linda?
Well, my initial response with your question is just not specifically with the surveys, but the other work we're doing. So the other work, just not with Reaching Home, but the other work Rural Development Network is doing in communities across the country. And I would say the number one challenge of why people are homeless that we're hearing over and over is racism and discrimination. And of course, with our Indigenous people are always overrepresented with homelessness and housing insecurity. But what we're hearing over and over again is it is so systemic racism and discrimination that's going on, and also with New Canadians. And so the other kind of area of where that's really impactful of the racism and discrimination is with our youth, between 16 and 24. And so I think Scott may have like a little bit of a different lens of what he would like to.
And I absolutely agree with Linda. This is very much related to that. Is just the lack of information, even for those, those in power, policymakers and municipal regional leaders. If they want to make a change, they don't know where to start because there's no information. They have no, Stats Canada might have very, very limited information on those who have housing, let alone those who don't. So not really understanding what the issue is quite tricky.
And also who's responsible. So it takes all roles of government to be able to respond, and the community to be able to respond. So it's just not the local municipality, it's just not the federal government, it's just not the provincial government, but everybody has to come to the table together on the political level to start to take a look. But there's often the miscommunication and saying, well, it's the federal government's responsibility or it's the provincial government's responsibility, and nobody's doing anything while they're trying to figure out whose responsibility it is to respond.
Thank you so much for answering that hardball question so very well. This session is so incredibly interesting. I'm going to give you, we have 1 more minute left, just a quick moment, I think. Linda and Scott, did you want to plug anything that's happening with this work as you think about the next steps that you want to leave folks with today?
Sure. I mean, we're always, as a not-for-profit, it's our mandate to create better and better resources for communities that have that capacity to use them. So we're always looking to improve, what we have and collaborate better. I'm very much, I don't know how to say this. We don't want competing methods. We don't want ours is better than yours or whatever, because we very much recognize that it totally depends on what you're doing, what community you're in, the size of it, the makeup of it. So if anyone thinks that they have some good ideas on how we can improve data gathering both in urban centers, rural centers, northern, remote, etc., we're always looking to collaborate there.
And I would just add quickly to please take a look at our website, follow us on different social media platforms, and as things become available. And in addition to that, we're happy to connect with people for the rest of the conference and after the conference to have one-on-one conversations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Linda and Scott. This has been a really, really interesting session, and I'll see you all later on in other sessions throughout the conference.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.